So welcome to the second session of our Anglicanism 101 series. This is my study. Delighted that you're here. And what we are quite simply doing today is we are looking at some of the building blocks of the Anglican faith. So last time we spoke a little bit about the history of Anglicanism, the history of the Church of Ireland. Then we talked a bit about how the Anglican tradition tends to try to be very much a house of reconciliation. Now, we often feel in being that, but we try to be a house of reconciliation. We are Catholic and we are Reformed. We are ancient and we are modern. In many ways, we are quite conservative as a tradition, but we are also quite radical as a tradition. And we try and be that via media, or that, like I said at the start, that house of reconciliation. So today what I want to do is I want to think a little bit about what I suppose we might call it the building blocks, what the building blocks are of the Anglican Church. What makes us Anglican? What defines us or describes us or sets us apart? Is there anything? So the format of this is very simple. Get yourself a cup of whatever you like to drink. I'm drinking tea. And let's just take some time, no more than I'd say about 20-25 minutes, and we'll think through some of these issues. All right, let's get stuck in. So it's often said that different religious traditions have different characteristics. I'm going to start with a joke. So the question's asked, how many people of a particular group can change a light bulb? So the first one is, how many charismatics does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, because their hands are already in the air. How many Pentecostals does it take to change a light bulb? And 10, 1 to change the bulb, and 9 to pray against the spirits of darkness. How many Roman Catholics does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is none, candles only, genuine origin, of course. Then here's the question, how many Anglicans does it take to change a light bulb? There's two answers to this. The first one is 3. 1 to change the bulb, 1 to mix the drinks, and 1 to talk about how much better the old bulb was. There's another answer to it which says, for Anglicans, it's impossible to change the light bulb, because there's always someone who says, my mother donated that bulb and you can change it over my dead body. It's interesting how different traditions often are represented as having characteristics, or represented as having sort of collective identities. And of course, any assertion of a collective identity is always overstated. So we should be careful here. But the question that sort of is set before us is that what constitutes our identity as people who refer to themselves as being Anglican? And that has another question to it, which is there actually any such thing as Anglican identity? And there can be a sort of romanticization of Anglican identity, and certainly media plays up on that, particularly when we look at representations of vicars and vicarages and parishes in influence through the BBC. But that picture is a stereotype, and Anglicanism has always been much broader and more fluid than that. I remember when Julie and I lived in Seattle, because I didn't grow up Anglican, I became Anglican. And it wasn't actually until we lived in the US that we became part of a cathedral called St. Mark's Cathedral in Seattle, a wonderfully vibrant Episcopal Anglican community. And it was through my encounter with that church that I fell in love with the Episcopal or the Anglican tradition. But if you looked around the landscape of the Episcopal Church in Seattle, you go to St. Mark's, where I went to, which was a fairly liberal, affirming, vibrant church. If you went down the road to the other Episcopal church, which I think was St. Paul's. St. Paul's was so different because St. Paul's was quite Anglo-Catholic, so you walked into St. Paul's and it was all what we call bells and smells, and in many ways it looked very Catholic. But then if you went into the Episcopal church in, I think it was in Ballard, that church was quite charismatic. So you went in, the hands were all up in the air, the worship was led by a very noisy type praise band. But then I began to find all these other little pop-up Episcopal churches around the Seattle area, things that were referred to as Angla, as an Anglican, Anglo-emergent, Anglican churches that met in coffee shops, that met in people's homes. So it actually became very hard to describe what makes someone Anglican. So the question is, what are the building blocks of our church? What is it that holds us together in unity? Because we actually don't have, we're not like the Presbyterians have a confession of faith, so that there's quite a strict definition of what Presbyterian doctrine is. Catholic Church obviously has a pope or a magisterium. So there is something there which actually says, here's exactly what a member of this church should believe. We don't really have that. We don't even have any distinctive Anglican creeds. Now, we say the Apostles' Creed and we say the Nicene Creed, but they are the great creeds of the Church Universal. They're not specifically Anglican creeds. So Anglicanism, we are not a confessional faith. Anglicanism isn't even a set of distinctive beliefs. In many ways, the best way to start to understand Anglican identity is to say that Anglicanism is an ethos and a method. It's an ethos and a method held together in communion. So let's have a think maybe about what some of those general building blocks or those ethoses might be. So we're going to think a bit about the building blocks of faith, and I'm going to draw here very much on the work of Richard Giles. I mentioned this book last time. It's called How to Be an Anglican, and he has a lovely little chapter in it which he calls building blocks, where he looks at the essential elements of Anglicanism. Now, a little book like this is by no way comprehensive, and you may disagree with everything I'm about to say and that Richard Giles says, and the fact that you would disagree with it probably suggests that you are doing good Anglicanism. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we look at the building blocks. He suggests 5 or 6 things, and we'll walk through those characteristics in the next 5 or 10 minutes. First one he says is this: Anglicans gravitate towards common sense and pragmatism. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the phrase common sense. I often find the phrase common sense is used by a majority to bully a minority, and something is only common sense if it is held in common by a certain group of people. We look at the Gospels, one of the things that Jesus does again and again is he takes things that would have been held in common or common sense things, and he turns them upside down. He explodes them, and by doing so he reveals new truths and new understandings. So I'm not a huge fan of the phrase common sense, but I understand the second part of it. Anglicans gravitate towards pragmatism. Anglican belief, Anglican theology tends to always emphasize a faith that can be applied in everyday life. We're suspicious about beliefs and theologies that are overly abstract. As Giles has this lovely line where he says, in matters of faith, Anglicans like solid food. Our emphasis tends to be on a faith that works. We often talk about the three-legged stool, and we say the three-legged stool of belief has scripture, reason, and tradition. Now, we are a Reformed tradition, so our emphasis is always on Scripture, but we're rooted in a very strong tradition. So tradition is always something that is to be explored. But the third Anglican leg is always reason. We believe in reason. Faith is not in competition with reason. Faith never asks us to suspend reason and simply to believe. Anglicans are suspicious of that. We emphasize reasonability, and we emphasize a faith that is consistently pragmatic. Faith has to be doable for us. Faith has to work. So the first building block is pragmatism. Second building block he suggests is simply a sense of geniality. So Anglicans are often accused of being rather woolly. You'll hear people say, oh, he's a typical woolly Anglican. And for many Anglicans, that's a bit of a trigger phrase, but I know where it comes from. We Anglicans tend to have an aversion to fundamentalism. And usually that's a good thing, but not necessarily so. Sometimes Anglicanism can be painfully vague. I remember I was asked a couple of years ago to write a statement for the church on a particular issue, and I remember working really hard to try and make sure that when the statement was put out, it was balanced and it shared both sides. And I remember a parishioner in Kilternan, who sadly is no longer with us, kind of smiling and laughing and saying, oh, it's a very typical Anglican position. We're so focused on seeing both sides that we often end up seeing nothing. And we work so hard to make sure everyone's happy and everyone's considered, and by doing so often nobody is happy and nobody is considered. And in some ways it's also a very middle class thing, and one of the critiques of Anglicanism that is fair is that Anglicanism is often dressed in very middle class clothing. We should be careful of that, because that's not actually representative of us as a global tradition. Now, there's something that is a virtue in geniality, particularly in the age we are in today, which is an age of such severe polarization. The last couple of weeks we've all been watching the election in the US, and man, I've been struck just by how polarized the world is and how we just can't find ways to be genial to one another. Anglicanism has always made a virtue of geniality. We don't take ourselves too seriously, and we often have the gift of believing that we may not always be right. A friend of mine used to say that whenever, as a good Anglican, he entered into a discussion with somebody who was more fundamentalist, he said, I always lost. And it wasn't because my arguments were weaker. My arguments were not weaker. It's because my default was to try to always find both sides, whereas his default was to try and defeat my side. Geniality is a virtue. We embrace it. Which moves us on to the third building block of Anglicanism, and that is a tendency towards generosity and a tendency towards inclusion. Anglicanism is reluctant to draw lines. We are reluctant to define. We are even more reluctant to exclude. And our symbolism is very much the symbolism of the open table. And we seek to model ourselves after Jesus, particularly the Jesus we meet in the Gospel according to St. Luke, but throughout all the Gospels, who ate with all people, who shared his table with people whose stories and backgrounds may have been questionable, but they were there with Jesus, no questions asked. And that sense of generosity and inclusion is the kind of thing that can get us in trouble, just like it got Jesus in trouble. The phrase for it is Anglican Comprehensiveness. We try to be comprehensive. Our default is never to find ways in which we can exclude people, because it's always easy to find a way to exclude someone. But our default is to emphasize belonging first. You'll hear people talk about this metric of belong and believe and behave. And it used to often be said that the way that within certain traditions things works is that you have to believe all the right things, you have to behave in a certain way, and then eventually once you've proved you can do those two, you can belong. But Anglican comprehensiveness has always said, no, we belong first. A sense of generosity and inclusion. And then our hope is that the behaving and the believing side comes. So, pragmatism, a sense of geniality, a sense of generosity or inclusion. But the fourth thing is we also like things to be done properly. Now, I recognize as I say that that's an unusual phrase. What does it mean to do things properly? And the temptation there is to say, no, that's actually tradition. Anglicans like tradition. And for many people, tradition is a bit of a trigger word. Now, I'm comfortable with the word tradition, but I'm always uncomfortable when tradition is mixed up with traditionalism. And we're going to have a whole session where we talk about Anglican tradition and Anglican approaches to tradition. Anglicans don't value traditionalism. Traditionalism is not a virtue. But we root ourselves very much within a tradition. And within that tradition, there is a gravitation towards order. And that's seen in how we do governance, how we do structure. It's seen, which can be painful at times. Man, I'm just finishing through the diocesan synod cycle where we're doing our various elections, and sometimes it seems tedious. But Anglicans value that sense of order and that sense of protection. And then when it comes to worship, there's much more freedom in Anglican worship than we may believe there is, but still there is a sense in Anglicanism that we have a structure or order for worship that actually values doing things properly. And perhaps to some extent that reflects within us a natural conservatism. So doing things properly. I'm going to appear to contradict that with the last one, which the last building block Giles suggests is we value exploration. Because our conservative nature in our desire to do things properly is only half the story. Anglicanism has always had within itself a sense of exploration. We talked a bit about this last time where we looked about how Anglicanism has within its DNA the ability to evolve and change. Anglicanism values theological bravery. We are generally willing as a church to push the frontiers of theological debate. And perhaps that comes from what I've said before. We like to be genial. We like to be reasonable. We like to be generous and inclusive of other people's thoughts and experiences. We have the confidence of a tradition. And part of that means that we encourage free thought and we encourage exploration. Now, that can bring its own challenges. And sometimes from the outside, people look at Anglicans and scratch their head and go, what the heck do you guys actually believe? Because that Anglican writer seems to suggest this, and this one seems to suggest something totally different. And Anglicanism is comfortable with that. We don't feel the need to force people to be cookie cutter and to think and act and be the same. That goes against the very building blocks of Anglicanism. We are a communion, and a broad communion at that. Just think about some of the challenges, though, when those blocks start to fall. Called this final little section falling blocks. So if the last section was building blocks, this is what happens when the blocks don't set up as well as they should. Because one of the challenges of not having a strict code is that maintaining unity can be a real challenge. And that's been the story of the church, and particularly in recent years, although I think it's been there in the church before. And we've seen it in a few years ago. It would have been a challenge at the time when women became ordained. We of course now have women priests and women bishops, but whenever that first became so, there was many in the church who were opposed to women clergy, and it became a great division within the church. And that's been even more pronounced in recent years with the question of homosexuality, the marriage of people who are gay, and the ordination of gay clergy. And that's played itself out globally, but also locally. We've seen huge rifts between the Episcopal Church in America and particularly the church in Africa. And those who pay close attention to these things will talk about there being the potential for split within the Anglican Communion. And Anglicans have worked hard in recent years to try and maintain unity, because unity is a virtue. But those splits happen in lots of different ways. They happen theologically. There is within Anglicanism those people who sit theologically with a very liberal tradition, and those who sit theologically within quite conservative traditions. And I think that happens in all churches, but I think some churches have more mechanisms and structures to rein in that diversity of thought in ways that perhaps Anglicans don't. There have been huge splits in regards to questions of ethics, but there's also huge splits in regards to how we do church, and in regards to people's churchmanship. Over in England, there's been a great push towards the Fresh Expressions movement, which has been a move towards the informalization of many of our liturgical structures. And that's been supported by not just the current Archbishop of Canterbury, but the previous Archbishop of Canterbury also. But there are many who struggle with that, who would like us to get back to the good old days of Anglican evensong. Of course, those things shouldn't exist in tension. And there are many people within Anglicanism who will say that this is how we do things. We talked a little bit about triggers here. For me, that's always a trigger. When someone says to me, that's not the way we do things as Anglican, I always stop them and I always ask them who the we is. Because when someone says that's not how we do things, it often means that's not how I like things to be done. It's very hard in Anglicanism to define exactly who the we is. There are some classic statements of Anglican identity. I'm going to mention a few of them here, because these are the things that try to hold us together in unity. The first one, and you don't need to remember this phrase, it's not important, we call it the Lambeth Quadriatric. So it's a reference to four things that were agreed in what was called the Lambeth Conference many moons ago. And the four statements of Anglican identity were Scripture, Sacrament, Creed, and Episcopate. Now, Episcopate is just a word for bishops, or that sort of structure of bishops. Now, they're the four things that are classic statements of Anglican identity, but of course, they're problematic. Scripture is always open to interpretation. Sacraments, well, the sacraments are baptism and communion, or they're the two great sacraments, but even people's understanding of what is happening at the great Anglican sacraments is open to interpretation, as is the creed. And even within the episcopate, we have a structure of episcopate, but there's not always agreement amongst bishops. So whilst we affirm scripture, sacrament, creed, and episcopate, it doesn't necessarily make the question of unity any easier. So Anglicans have traditionally said that there are four what we call instruments of unity, or more technically we call it instruments of communion. There are four things that are meant to symbolically hold us together. The first one is actually the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, or herself as it could be, but it's himself. At the minute, that is the Archbishop of Canterbury is Justin Welby. Before that it was Rowan Williams. And the Archbishop of Canterbury is not, as I'll sometimes hear people say, the Anglican version of the Pope. That's not who the Archbishop of Canterbury is. When it comes to issues of doctrine, the Archbishop of Canterbury can't set out a doctrine that we all have to follow. But he's a symbol of unity. He's a symbol who gathers together the Anglican Communion worldwide. There are three other instruments of communion. One is the Lambeth Conference, which is a conference that meets once every 10 years and brings together all of the bishops from across the world. And it's meant to be this time where the archbishops come together for discussion and dialogue, kind of joint vision casting, understanding of the other. Of course, for those who've watched it closely, the last number of years, the Lambeth Conference has been controversial. Who do we invite? Who do we not invite? If you invite that person, this person won't come. And sadly, the Lambeth Conference hasn't always embodied unity in the way that it was meant to. Two other instruments of unity. One is what's called the Anglican Consultative Council, and the other, which is the Primates Meeting, which takes place every couple of years. Here's how the Lambeth Conference defined the Anglican Communion. And I think this is quite helpful. They describe the Anglican Communion as a fellowship, which had the following characteristics in common. One, they uphold and they propagate or they share the Catholic and Apostolic faith and orders as generally set forth in the Book of Common Prayer. Two, they are particular, or they are national churches, and as such they promote within each of their own territories a natural expression of the Christian faith and life and worship. And thirdly, they are bound together not by a central legislative and executive authority, but by mutual loyalty sustained by the common council of the bishops in conference. Now, there's a lot of words in that, but I think when you distill it, this is what it says. Anglican Communion is not a centralized body. It's not a form that you fill in, but it's a fellowship. It's a gathering of people around a similar purpose, reason, and goal. And it gathered together by a few things. One, it's always particular or national, which is why we are the Church of Ireland, the Church of England over there, the Episcopal Church of Scotland. But it's bound together by some sort of mutual loyalty to this idea of being the Anglican Church. I read someone say Anglicanism isn't like cricket, because in cricket there needs to be international rules agreed and regulations signed up to, and if that rules are not kept, then someone is kicked out because they are not playing cricket. Anglicanism doesn't have that kind of power and authority, but there's a moral authority. And when Anglican works at its best, it works with an understanding of being a fellowship. In many ways, a microcosm of Anglicanism is every single parish church. When the church works well, when we treat each other with generosity, congeniality, and with grace. But when we don't, it doesn't work that well. Listen, I'm going to stop there today. I realise today I barely even touched my tea. Listen, in the next number of weeks we're going to get in a little bit more to the what I may call nitty-gritty of Anglicanism. What is our approach to Scripture? How do Anglicans pray? How do we understand authority, and how do we deal with the sort of ethical issues that face us today? So stick around, and we'll upload new content next Friday.